So in this lesson, it's my goal to sort of convince you of the fact that there's a number that you've never seen before, and that number is called the imaginary number. It's unlike any other number you've ever dealt with before, and it's actually not even going to look like a number. It's going to look like a letter. But in order to get there, I sort of need to convince you that we need this number, and so that's what we're going to do first. So I'm going to start with a review question. My first review question is, what is the square root of 9? Right? And the answer that you're likely to come up with is 3. Somebody might say -3. These are both good answers, right? The square root of 9 could be 3, could be -3. My big follow-up question is going to be, why? Why is the square root of 9 equal to 3? Why is the square root of 9 equal to -3? And I'd like you to pause the video and come up with a sentence. Why is the square root of 9 +3? Think about that. Okay, so you've been thinking about this, and hopefully you come up with some sort of answer like this. The square root of 9 is 3 because if we multiply two 3's together, we get 9. The concept of a square root is such that you're looking for a number that when multiplied by itself gives you the number that we were looking for the root of. The reason that -3 also works is that if we multiply -3 by -3, we will get +9. So that's what the square root of 9 is, and that's why it's the square root of 9. So my next review question is slightly trickier, right? I'm now going to ask you, what is the square root of 7? Right? And the answer here is, it's a little bit harder. I mean, like, pause the video, see if you can come up with a sentence that would answer, what is the square root of 7? And the answer I'm coming up with is this. So the square root of 7 is some number, not a nice number that we know off the top of our heads, but it's some number that when multiplied by itself is equal to 7. When I say, what's the square root of 7? It's the square root of 7. When I multiply it by another square root of 7, and this is the key part, the square root of 7 times the square root of 7 will be 7. By definition, the square root of 7 is something that when multiplied by itself is supposed to give me 7. And so if we've got that basic idea down, we're ready to tackle what the imaginary number is. So my new question is, what's the square root of -1? What is the square root of -1? And think for a minute about what that question means. What it basically means is, what number, when multiplied by itself, gives us -1? And this should bother you a lot, because you start thinking about things. You're like, oh, what about -1? When I do -1 times -1, it gives me, oh, okay, +1. I was hoping for -1. Then you start thinking, well, what if I did +1? +1 times, okay, never mind, that's also +1. At some point, somebody gets the idea, like, oh, well, maybe we could do -1 times +1. But if you think about it, that doesn't work either. This needs to be a number that when multiplied by itself gives us -1. And so the reality is, at this point in your mathematical careers, you have never seen a number like this. And so lots of times in math, when we've never seen something before, when there's not a number around for when you can't do it, we have to define a number. And so right here is where I make this definition. And the thing I'm about to make here is indeed a definition. I'm going to make this definition on actually the next slide. Here it is. The square root of -1 is a new number. It's called I. It's the imaginary number, right? This may be a little bit crazy to you, but you're going to have to trust me on this one, right? The idea is the square root of -1 does not have a real number associated with it. There is no real number, and I mean that sort of in the mathematical term of real. There is no real number that you've encountered, or that anyone has encountered, that is the square root of -1. So we need a new number. It's called the imaginary number, and we use the symbol I to represent that number. Anytime we're working with imaginary numbers, it's important that you remember that I is not just a letter. I is actually a number. I is representing the number that we don't see or understand. It is the square root of -1. And so now we're going to start doing things with that imaginary number. And the first thing I want to do, the last thing I'm actually going to do in this video, is I'm going to talk about raising that imaginary number to a power. Right? So we're willing to accept I, right? You're willing to accept that there's an imaginary number. But then I'm going to ask a crazy question, like, what is I squared? What happens when I take this imaginary number and I square it, right? And it's actually a pretty simple thing. If you think about it, what does I squared mean? It means I times I, right? But each of those i's is the square root of -1. So when somebody says I squared, they're saying, hey, what happens when I multiply I by itself? But that should be obvious to us. When I take the square root of -1 and multiply it by itself, I'm supposed to get -1. And so that sort of tells us, hey, when you take I squared, when you have I squared, it means -1. It is -1, right? And we can go further with that. What happens if I do I cubed? What happens if I raise I to the third power? Well, what does I to the third power mean, right? It means I times I times I. It means 3 of them multiplied together. But sort of think about how we could simplify that, right? We just learned that I squared is -1. So if I were to take I times I times I and sort of choose to multiply 2 of them together, we know that I times I is supposed to be -1, and this other guy, well, this guy here is just imaginary, so I'd have -1 times I. It turns out I cubed is -I. So anytime we encounter I cubed, we're going to be able to simplify that and just write, hey, that's actually just the negative of the imaginary number. 2 of the i's multiplied together to give me -1, the other I remains to give me -I. And the last one of these I'm actually going to ask you guys to do on your own, because I think you should be able to figure it out. I want you to sort of process, what is I to the 4th power? So pause the video for a minute, think about this process of what we've used, and see if you can come up for yourself with what I to the 4th is. Well, I to the 4th is I times I times I times I. Right? Now my thought is, we can combine the first 2 of them, and we can combine the second 2 of them, and sort of think about what those are. Right? I times I, the first 2 i's, will be -1, because we remember up here, I squared is -1. Anytime you get 2 i's together multiplied, it's going to be -1. Now the second 2 i's here, when they're multiplied together, they also give us -1. But when I have -1 times -1, it gets me +1. So this final thought is that I to the 4th power gives me +1. We can raise I to even higher powers, but I'm going to have to get into that in the next video, so I'll see you there.